Hey everyone, Chris here from IELTSadvantage.com. Hope that you're doing well. And in today's lesson, we're going to look at idioms, specifically how idioms are lowering your score. So for many of you, you believe that you can't get a high score on the speaking test unless you use idioms or lots of idioms. And for many of you, you think that this is the secret to success, that learning idioms and using idioms will get you a high score. So today we're going to look at 4 ways idioms can lower your score. For most of you, idioms are lowering your score rather than increasing your score. So we're going to look at the 4 ways in which they do that. And then we're going to talk about how you can learn and use idioms effectively. So number 1, focusing too much on idioms. So as I've just mentioned, many of you focus way too much on idioms and believe that they have a far higher value than they really do. And you spend more time focusing on them than focusing on what really matters. And if you're wanting to get a band 7, 8 or 9 in the IELTS test, you really need to focus all of your attention on the things that get you a band 7, 8 or 9 and ignore things that do not. Idioms are not going to really increase your score. So where does this misinterpretation come from? Well, it's not your fault. As a student, you are really guided by what your teachers say or what you read on the internet or what other people tell you. And where it comes from is a misinterpretation of this idiomatic language. So if you look at the official marking criteria for the IELTS speaking test, under lexical resource, which is basically vocabulary, under band 7 and band 8, it will talk about idiomatic language. So many people have looked at this, and without understanding what idiomatic means, they just see idiom and think that that's what it means. Idiomatic and idiom do not mean the same thing. Idiomatic language, that's just language that native English speakers normally use. It's the natural everyday English that if you were in, if you came to my hometown, you would hear people talking effortlessly. And if you can use that everyday native English type English? Is that even an expression? If you can use that type of language in the IELTS test, in the speaking test, you speak more like a native English speaker, then you'll do quite well. Okay, but it doesn't mean idioms. Idioms are part of it, but a very, very, very small part of it. Okay, and they are not magic, all right? So if you spend too much time focusing on idioms, you're going to have this mindset that all you have to do is just learn a lot of idioms and you'll do well on the speaking test. Not true, all right? It's not going to work like that. And again, that means that you will be focusing on things that do not matter and not spending enough time on things that do matter. So let's think about the speaking test. 25% pronunciation, nothing to do with idioms. 25% fluency and coherence, nothing to do with idioms. 25% grammar, nothing to do with idioms. 75% of your test has nothing to do with idioms. So if you think that they're the secret to getting a high score, you're wrong. 25% of your test is going to be about vocabulary, but idioms are a very small part of that. And you have to learn how to use grammar effectively and appropriately, not just learn a bunch of idioms. Number 2, let's talk about the writing test. So many students in the comments below will ask me, should I use idioms on the writing test? So let's talk about each part of the test. Task 2, no, do not use them. It's an academic type essay. It doesn't matter if you're doing general training or academic, it's an academic style essay. You're not going to use informal language like idioms or proverbs or quotes or any of those things in your task 2 essay. Just don't use them. Task 1 academic, do not use them for the same reason as not using them in task 2. Task 1 general training, you're going to have to write a letter which is going to be either formal or informal. So if you get a formal letter, you're not going to be using idioms because you don't use informal language in formal letters. Informal letters, you might use them, but it's highly unlikely that you're going to use them. As we're going to look at in a second, native English speakers do not use idioms that often. You're not going to be, constructing your letter by using a bunch of idioms. You might have 1 or 2 in there, but only use them if it's appropriate and accurate to do so. Number 3, so if we move on from the writing test to the speaking test, it is totally fine to use idioms in the speaking test. However, many of you overuse them. So some of the people that I speak to in the test, and you'd ask them something like, where are you from? Like, tell me about your hometown. And they'll say, you really hit the nail on the head with that question, and I'm over the moon that you asked about it. And I'm over, you know, it's like they start off every answer with like 4 idioms without even answering the question. If you do that, you're not really telling the examiner, I'm a high-level English speaker. You're telling the examiner, I learned a load of idioms. You're not really doing anything related to increasing your score, anything related to the marking criteria. Again, pronunciation, fluency and coherence, grammar, vocabulary. 3/4 of those have nothing to do with idioms. One of them does, but it's got a lot more to do with how you use vocabulary and whether you use it accurately and appropriately, rather than just using a bunch of idioms. So next time you're listening to native English speakers talk to each other, you might live in an English-speaking country, or you might be listening to a podcast or listening to, you know, a TV show or something like that. Count how many times in 5 minutes native English speakers use idioms. It's probably 0 or very close to 0. We do not use them that often. So why do you think using them over and over and over and over again? Some people sound like they've just, you know, eaten an idiom book and they've regurgitated it up in the speaking test. Why do you think that would be appropriate to do so? And if you're overusing them, number one, you're not communicating effectively with the examiner. But number two, you're probably making lots and lots and lots of mistakes. So what mistakes are you going to be making? Number one, you could be making pronunciation mistakes. So if you are just looking at a list of idioms, you're not really learning how to say them properly. So for example, I'll often get students saying, oh, I passed with flying colour. So they're not saying the last consonant sound, which is colours, which is how you would say that idiom effectively. Because they've just looked at a list of idioms, they haven't actually heard that idiom, and they haven't got feedback on how to say that idiom properly. They're going to use it incorrectly and lower their mark for pronunciation, which is 25% of your total mark. This is probably the most common error, which is accuracy, just saying them incorrectly. So if you say, let's for example, you hit the nail on the head, which is an idiom. A lot of people will say, you hit nail on head, all right? They miss out the article there. You're demonstrating to the examiner that, again, you just learned a load of idioms and your accuracy is a problem. Or you said, I'm over moon, instead of I'm over the moon. You've just told the examiner, I don't know how to use articles, lowering your mark for grammar. You might also lower your mark for vocabulary because you're demonstrating that you do not know how to use that idiom properly. So you're lowering your score by using them inaccurately. Again, this comes from not learning them properly. If you just learn a list of idioms instead of actually hearing how they actually sound and hearing them in context, you're not going to learn how to use them effectively. Same with appropriacy. It doesn't matter if you know how to pronounce the idiom correctly and you know how to say it correctly, you know, there's no problem with your accuracy, but you're not using it appropriately. You have to use idioms at the appropriate time, within the appropriate context. And if you're not doing that, you're demonstrating that you do not know how to use them. So how can you learn and use them effectively in the test? Number one, don't look at lists, all right? Lists of idioms are not going to help you. The only way to learn this high-level English, this idiomatic language, is to really hear it within context. So hear it and use real English. So for example, a podcast or a TV show or speaking to native English speakers or watching a movie. That's real English that you actually hear, and you're going to hear the idioms in context. So when you hear an idiom or you hear a phrase, you don't quite understand what it means, stop your podcast or stop your TV show or ask the native English speaker, like, what does that mean? And then you will hear it natively, hear it within context, and remember it and be able to use it better. You should note down any new idioms and write down the context, write down the pronunciation, and then review those regularly. And then you have to use them and not be afraid to make mistakes. You will make mistakes when you're using them, but get someone to give you feedback on your use of idioms and correct those ones that you know. And then you'll be able to use them effectively. You'll be able to not just learn them and add them to your passive vocabulary, but move them to your active vocabulary, the vocabulary that you know how to use effectively. So that's how you do it, and it's not the easiest way, it's not the shortest way, but the easiest short ways, you know, the ways that take learning a list of idioms it's very quick and it's very easy, but it's not effective, all right? Actually learning them properly is a little bit harder and takes a longer time, but you're doing it properly, all right? There are no shortcuts, there are no cheats, okay? So hopefully that raised your awareness a little bit about idioms, and I will take some questions now. Okay, so in my institutions, I have seen that they accentuate to use idioms. I don't know what that means, but I think you mean that they tell you to use lots of idioms. Yeah, that's not correct. I'm not saying that you can't use idioms in the speaking test, but only use them if you're 100% sure about the pronunciation, your accuracy, and the appropriacy of using them. So I think we have to avoid idioms. As I said, don't avoid them, only use them. Same with anything, same with phrasal verbs, any vocabulary, any grammar. Only use it in the test if you're 100% sure about it. If you are not 100% sure about it, don't use it in the test. When you're preparing, when you're practicing, you should be using things that you're unsure of, trying to bring yourself out of your comfort zone, take you to the next level. But in the test, don't be using things unless you're 100% sure about them. Mohammed, what about using these idioms correctly and naturally? Perfect, yeah, you do use them, that's great, but most of you do not know how to use them, so don't. Can we use idioms in writing task 2? No. We can focus to enhance own vocabulary instead of idioms. Yes and no. Many of you think that vocabulary is just idioms. It's not. When I did this lesson on Facebook, one of the questions was, well, if we can't use idioms, then what do we use? Like, what can we use? The person thought that there was nothing left. The person was ignoring 99.99% of the English language. Learn how to use words and phrases effectively. And if they are idioms, great. If they're not, doesn't matter. They're a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the English language. Does this mean that we shouldn't use idioms in writing? Yes, it does. Don't use them. How about proverbs? Exactly the same. Even worse. So if you use a proverb in writing or use a proverb in speaking, what are you doing? What are you demonstrating? You're demonstrating memorization. You're not demonstrating that you know how to use the English language. It is not a memorization test. It is not a how many proverbs can you memorize test. It is an English test. So using a proverb, it's not like the examiner is going to be like, oh, they used a proverb, let's give them a band 9. No, they're going to look, for speaking, they're going to look at everything that you say, the total of your output in the speaking test, and they're going to give you a mark based on that. So what often happens is people will memorize lots of proverbs or lots of idioms or lots of things, like lots of little phrases, and they might use some of them properly. But what's very, very apparent is they can't use basic grammar and basic vocabulary. They keep making lots and lots and lots of little mistakes. And that's an indication that you do not know how to, you're not at that level yet that you want to be at. It's not, the infrequent things you do well, it's the frequent things you don't do well, if that makes sense. What if I don't use idioms in task 2? Is it going to cost my band score? I don't know how many times I'm going to have to say this, but don't use idioms in task 2, right? Whoever is telling you to use idioms in task 2, run very far away from them, because if they're telling you that, then there's probably 50 other things that they're teaching you that that are lowering your score. So be very careful with people who tell you things like that, because they are pretending to be English teachers. They're pretending to be IELTS teachers, pretending to get your money from you. Is it important to use idioms? Okay, I think now that they haven't watched the video. Okay, now I understand why people are asking those types of questions. No, it's not important. Is does hold water an idiom? Yeah, it is. Does it means like, does it stand up to scrutiny? Is it reliable? What if a local IELTS speaking interviewer gives focus on idioms rather than they're not going to be giving a focus on idioms. They're not going to be doing that. The examiners are not going to have a focus on idioms. They just won't do that because the criteria is exactly the same in every single country. I know you don't believe that, but it's true. If I use 2 or 3 idioms, will it affect my speaking score? If you use them correctly and appropriately, it will improve your score. If you use them inaccurately or inappropriately, it will lower your score. What does idiomatic language mean? It means that language that native English speakers would normally use. Okay, not advanced language, but just normal everyday language, like phrasal verbs, colloquialisms, maybe slang, idioms, things like that. How do I improve my vocabulary in a month's time? You won't. You will improve it a little bit, but you'll probably not improve it to the level that you need to be at. It's like pronunciation. Pronunciation, you can't improve pronunciation dramatically. Like from a band 5 to a band 7 pronunciation, you're not going to do that in 1 month. Band 5 to band 7 vocabulary, you're not going to do that in 1 month. Adjust your expectations and then... Thank you. I will try to avoid using idioms in writing task 2 from now on. I wouldn't try to avoid, I would just not put them in at all. Okay, alright guys, so I'm getting the same questions over and over and over again, so I'm going to leave it there. If you didn't watch the beginning of the video will go up pretty much immediately onto the channel and you can check it out and have a look there. Thank you very much. Hope that you learned something from that. And if you need anything, if you have any other questions, pop it in the comments below the video, or go to IELTSadvantage.com where you'll find the answers to 99% of your questions. And if you want help with your IELTS preparation, feel free to send me an email, chris@IELTSadvantage.com. Thank you very much, guys. Bye-bye.